Hi everyone, welcome to Rubble of Empires. This is just going to be a sort of channel update video, so get ready for that. I feel like I'm in a bit of a weird position creatively at the moment. I don't have a lot of time, and I'm not using the time that I do have that wisely. So yeah, for that reason I'm not being as productive as I would otherwise be. So at the moment, I've got one batch of videos where I've kind of done enough work on all of them to spend as much time as I possibly could without actually finishing a video. And I've done that with all of them. So there's like short videos where I've done the short amount of work minus the 10% you would actually need to do to upload it. And then, same deal with the longer ones. And so it feels like procrastination. So anyway, in that procrastinating spirit, I have come up with a whole new batch of video ideas that I wanted to run by you just because I thought it would give you guys some content, basically. The first video idea is something I was calling A Tale of Two Dads, which would compare these two examples of dads relating to gender identity in the media. And one of them is this super Christian guy that was testifying. I'm not sure if it was on behalf of the ACLU, but they sort of endorsed his testimony to some government panel where he was saying, please, I think he was even talking about sports. So King Critical did a really good breakdown of this and exposed the fact that he's saying these really reactionary things about gender and sex, but because the conclusion that he comes to is, so then I transitioned my kid, no one gives a shit how fucked up the premises that conclusion is based on are. So that was one example, and then there's another example of a parent who was just speaking out against gender identity ideology, but because their kid has a gender identity, that's essentially, I think the argument was that essentially amounted to child abuse. And so parents in Canada are in a weird position. This guy was Canadian, because there's extra limitations on what they're allowed to say because it would affect their children in the eyes of this mad ideology. So I thought, comparing those two things in a video, particularly if it was short and snappy, and cool and creative and everyone loved it. So I thought that would be cool. Another thing that I thought would be excellent is most of what I think is wrong with the left is essentially that it's been defeated by capital. So, and defeated by capital, in a way where it's sort of been colonized by capital rather than, nuked off the map. It's been kept in place, but capital has just figured out how to control it through NGOs and universities and manufacturing consent. So I'm not sure exactly what the link is, but I think there's a definite connection between some of the worst elements of the modern left, and in particular we'll say the reactionary role that Antifa can play in silencing freedom of speech, essentially. And I think a lot of people don't understand the history behind Antifa or Antifa, and for example, it was a phenomenon in Europe, for many decades before it ever became something that a mainstream newspaper in America would mention. And I think potentially it was, not useful at all, but I think that in its original kind of European context where there were literal neo-Nazis, then I can potentially see the argument for it. And that's not to say that there aren't, actual fascists in Australia. I guess my point is that there's a certain element of the modern left where they too want their fair game. They too want their bad people that they can just do whatever they want to. And an example of this that most people probably wouldn't be aware of was the campaign to stop Huntingdon animal cruelty, or SHAC, and it began in the UK and migrated to the US. And it's actually a very interesting kind of case study in social movements. So what it did was they identified one company, Huntingdon Life Sciences, or HLS, and they were the largest vivisection company in. This was a animal rights campaign, which I think is interesting because animal rights, I feel like a lot of times is like the lefty equivalent of like pro-life, because you have a perceived victim that is like beyond reproach. Like you can't blame a puppy and you can't blame a fetus. And so if you perceive a harm being done to them, it's like, what, I can do anything in response to this because it's in the name of purity. And ironically, vegetarianism is connected to The Sopranos in my mind, because in The Sopranos, Tony Soprano, spoiler alert, Gen Z, obviously a big part of The Sopranos was the relationship that Tony Soprano had with his psychiatrist. And in the end, that relationship ends because the psychiatrist finally comes to the conclusion that Tony Soprano is a sociopath, or one of the paths, and as a result, talk therapy wasn't any good as a way to treat them, and in fact, can make them worse. And one of the characteristics in the diagnosis was this kind of fondness for animals and children. And Tony Soprano has this super, animal loving thing. He has ducks that land in his pool that he tries to take care of, and the rest of the family don't give a shit. But he's like, the ducks! And he has a horse that he murders someone, essentially, in part over, and those types of things. So my point isn't that it's one thing leads to the other, that vegetarianism is connected with sociopathy, but it definitely has an element of compatibility with sociopathy, where you can't connect humanly to complicated relationships, and in particular relationships where there's mutual exchange. Yeah, the ones where the only time he can do affection is when it's to an animal or a baby, or something like that. And part of that is, you see the rest of the world is just kind of tainted and horrible, because they're not part of the pure. And so it works really well to give you this kind of, it's like that black and white thinking. And I don't think it's a surprise that in that period, sort of late 90s, those were the two campaigns, were the animal rights campaign and the pro-life campaign, where white people were kind of driven to pseudo-insurgency or those types of tactics. I don't think it's a coincidence. So anyway, they had a model, and their model was basically to deprive Huntingdon Life Sciences of any economic partners to trade with. So, for example, they came up with secondary and tertiary targets, because the logic was it's never going to be in Huntingdon Life Sciences' interest to not be Huntingdon Life Sciences, because 100% of their profits come from being Huntingdon Life Sciences. So however, the company's one step out, they may only do, 20%, 5%, 2% of their business with Huntingdon Life Sciences, HLS, I'll start saying, because, and so as a result, they can more easily sever ties, and particularly when you get to what tertiary targets, which are businesses that do business, they're even more totally, I don't give a shit, I'll drop it. The thing is the way that they would get these victories was through very dubious, was essentially through the same means that Scientology applies to fair game, people that they can attack, like the kind of, what they call them, squirrel teams. Yeah, they're like teams of like 3 people that will rock up on people's doorsteps with cameras and harass them. And yeah, that type of thing. That's exactly what Shaq was doing, but it involved explicit kind of, well, the way that they would do it is the campaign would just identify potential targets and then be like, sort of hands off, or like it's up to the movement to decide what it's going to do with this information. And so they would have people demonstrating outside people's homes at like personal private residences at 2 o'clock in the morning, and the property destruction, these types of things. And one of the interesting things is this was super effective. At least for a short time, until what happens later happened. But initially, they bankrupted Huntington Life Sciences like a couple of times, and it had to be, banks stopped loaning money or having anything to do with Huntington Life Sciences at all, because the campaign had gotten big enough to, be able to put pressure on banks and the businesses that do businesses with banks. So they severed ties, and at one point the government essentially had to bail out HLS to stop it from going bankrupt. And so in the end, what they did was they moved from the UK to the US. So that meant, that the activists would take more time building up in the US, and they could also potentially, and in actuality, the US government would provide a better environment for doing business in, because very quickly, it seems, after Shack US getting set up, they got sued and put in jail for their organizing, and the FBI basically said that what they were encouraging people to do could amount to interstate stalking, and so they got prosecuted on that basis. And I'm not sure if this was directly in relation to that or just kind of soon after that. There was legislation passed specifically to target Shack-like activities and people doing things that were, the language was something to the effect of, that would interfere with a business that uses animals. It was, closer to the war on terror and all the hysteria around that. So they painted it as a anti-terrorist kind of legislation. And so that pretty quickly killed the movement off completely. I'm not sure what HLS is doing these days, but I think it's an interesting case to look at, because a lot of liberals don't seem to understand that there is some kind of power in riots and property destruction. One of the weirdest things I've heard people say, and I'm open to hearing why this is wrong, is there's like, oh, the riots have always made things worse in America, like they've always made the black community worse, and it's all, wrecked and stuff after the riots. But there was riots from Martin Luther King's death up until the passing of, I forget what it was, but it was like 4 or 5 days later, key civil rights legislation. So there is a historical precedent around, one of the main black civil rights leaders of hardcore rioting being associated with a massive improvement in the legal rights of black America. And that often gets looked over, I feel. And yeah, one of the things about this campaign is that it shows that there is, there's like forces outside of politics. There are economic forces that you can actually influence. The issue, I believe, is that the way they were trying to influence them was like, there are a bunch of different issues I have with the campaign, but one of the issues is that the way that they were trying to influence things was through these kind of like mafia kind of mafia Scientology, like extortion-y type things. And I think, there's, in any kind of power struggle, there's going to be a power struggle. The reason why strikes are so powerful is because it kind of cuts right to the core of the functioning of the entire society, and it stops everything through withdrawal. And that is a completely different, like, stopping things through an act of intervention where you like clog up an area or that kind of thing, is like useful and potentially useful or significant, but it has a weakness in that it sort of relies on physical force to keep an area occupied, and the government has superior physical force. But what the government doesn't have is a second working class that it can replace its current working class with if its current working class withdraws its labor. So in specific industries, if those people just walk away, there's no one else who can come in and do that. And that is the power of the working class. And that's the power that can overthrow politicians and monarchies and that type of thing. It's not like there's this impression that a lot of people have of a revolution being a military struggle, but it's kind of an organizational struggle, because at the moment, like, the capitalist class is extremely organized in pursuing its own interests, to the point that the working class has no other option but to sell their labor to these people for whatever price they can get for it. So it's not a matter of like a military victory, because even like if the bourgeoisie all just like died of a plague tomorrow, we don't have any counter organization that could overtake or replace the existing structures. So all that's going to happen is that just, everyone moves up a step and we fill the gap, and society keeps on ticking. Part of the reason for socialism and communism being based in the working class is the unions. And essentially you see, like, most people can kind of comprehend that to some degree, when there are unions in an industry, unions and bosses both kind of have a certain amount of control over how workplaces look and are organized, and it's an adversarial relationship. But both organizations do have some input. And what a revolution is when you have such a high degree of organization among the working class that they can organizationally replace the capitalist class. So the question of revolution is the question of organizational capacity. And kind of clandestine guerrilla organizing doesn't necessarily lend itself to... It can achieve certain things very well, but it also is completely incapable of achieving other things. Like, you need large above ground organizations to include like the entire class of people. It's not the insurgency and the like physical property destruction that people can do that will cause kind of fundamental change. And any change you can do through those means, I think it'll obviously always be temporary, because it can't like get you out of the situation. So I wanted to do a video exploring that. So I wanted to do a commentary. I've been wanting to do a commentary for Money and the Cost of Gender for ages, and that's probably one of the easiest things to do, but it'd take maybe the longest time. Anyway, and in doing the commentary, I particularly wanted to focus on episode 2, because I made a couple of mistakes, probably a bunch of mistakes, in that video. And one of them was, at one point I said 300,000 years when it should have been 3 million years. And at another point, like, I had basically had to boil down this long-standing disagreement between Marxist feminism or Marxism and radical feminism. And that was, it's essentially like, does patriarchy cause class society, or does class society cause patriarchy? Yeah, and it's a long kind of discussion. I don't really have the time to, do it here, but I just wanted to mention it. And I also wanted to redo the video of, I think it's called Delusion at this point. It's a video of like Riley and then ContraPoints really close together, and it always gets a lot of comments from Riley fans, and they always say the same shit in response to it, and it's quite easily rebutted. So I wanted to kind of do an updated version with the rebuttals built in, just to see how they responded to that. I wanted to respond to King Critical's video that he made about definitions and how to use the terms sex and gender. And I thought it was an interesting video. Again, it's like something that'll take more time. But just for now, I kind of disagreed. I think ultimately that there are clearer ways of explaining it. I also don't necessarily think, I don't think the problem is talking past each other in general. So I didn't have the same motivation for a new definition. And also, there was another video, I think it was the ACLU video, where I feel like, I'd have to see it again, but when I saw it, it struck me that it seemed to be an example of King Critical, he called sex sex instead of calling it gender. At this specific point, and to me it was obvious why, and it was because it was clearer and it conveyed what he was trying to say better. We could have a little feud over and get sectarian about it. But yeah, King Critical has been fucking killing it recently. I have really liked his videos. So has You're Kidding Right, Plebity, Artie Morty, Ella Androphobia is amazing. Distorted Lens just keeps getting better and better. Actual Feminism hasn't done anything in ages. I'm annoyed about that. Okay. So there was a comment thread that I didn't see the conversation unraveling until it was kind of over. It was between people who were saying that, like a libertarian argument, essentially, that capitalism is freedom, and other people who were saying that it wasn't. And the libertarian said something to the effect of, Rubble of Empires uses Marxism to kind of counter the postmodern individualism, but he doesn't really, it's not like he actually believes in a communist revolution. Yeah, no, that's not true. I do. I am definitely a lot more, I'm a lot less certain about what the specifics of that would entail these days, but definitely I think that collective ownership of the means of production is a good thing. Yeah, I feel like we're kind of ending up in this weird, people have called it neo-feudalism, which basically means under feudalism, you were in a situation where the serfs worked on land that was owned by the king or whatever. This is going to be very vague. And they would take a certain amount of the serfs' work each season. There'd be a tax, essentially. And so it was a step up from slavery in that it meant that you weren't physically chained to where you had to work and, held in place by whips, because that's a really obvious form of subjugation. And serfdom was, in comparison, it appeared to be more free. So what capitalism did was it took it a step further, and instead of being physically restrained in a spot or having some of your work being taken away by somebody, Instead, what capitalism does is, whereas a serf knows how much they have produced for the entire year, and then they lose some of that to the tax or the tribute or whatever it is, a worker often has no idea how much value they are actually producing for the company. And so when they get their wages at the end of the week, psychologically, it's different to having all that money there and then someone come in and take it away. Instead, they start with nothing and then they get something, and it's like, holy like, look at what I got. And the robbery is kind of invisibly contained within the business model. But now what we're seeing with the internet is this situation where, I guess because of corporate forces, I haven't really thought about why this happened, but we've starting to get, these platforms, and all of us kind of work on these platforms, often for free, creating content for our masters. And if that ever becomes profitable to a certain point, they take a chunk of whatever we make, as well as essentially owning a lot of what is produced as well. And so in a sense, we're returning to a kind of feudal relationship, which might be easier to overthrow in some ways. I feel like it must have been so crazy to have been alive at a time when the people who were in power, I guess it's still the same, but that they were kind of held in place by magic. Like the concept of royal blood and all that type of thing is like, yeah, God kept them there. So what happens when we go back to those feudal relationships, but we're like living in an atheist society? But one of the things that came up in the discussion was about the idea of whether capitalism is the more free system. There are a lot of assumptions that bourgeois thinking or capitalist thinking makes about the world. And one of the assumptions is that there's something kind of natural to the order of class hierarchy. What's harder to recognize now is that it actually takes careful management to foster the introduction of classes. So I haven't read it, and not having read Marx is my claim to fame, I guess. Or one of the greatest shames of this channel is probably a better way to say it. But I was talking to someone recently who was telling me about the last chapter, and how the last chapter of Capital, sorry, not Marx in general, but Capital, is specifically to do with Australia and the establishment of Australia. And there are two cities. One is Perth, which is on the far western side of Australia, and the other is Adelaide, which is essentially in the middle but down the bottom. And when they established Perth, they did this thing where everyone who settled there all got a little plot of land, and it caused the colony to collapse a whole bunch of times because they couldn't establish capitalist relations, because they didn't have a working class, because everybody had their own self-sufficient or their way of being autonomous, I guess. So when they founded Adelaide, instead of giving every person who showed up land, all the land was owned by a corporation, and then that corporation sold off lots of land for something like £80. And so that automatically created people who had a way to sustain themselves, and people who had no other option but to sell their labor to somebody who had that ability. And that's how they were able to manufacture a working class. This is like a problem of industrialization in general, because when you look at like the big death tolls of Stalin and Mao, they were both associated with in trying to industrialize the country. And essentially the same process that happened in Western Europe, where the peasants essentially had to be driven off the land, the commons had to be closed, because people didn't naturally, like, they found it degrading in a lot of ways to work for somebody. And I think today we wouldn't realize that because it's so just part of the fabric of it's in the water, like it's the water we swim in kind of thing. And so what the death tolls in these communist countries were often was just a kind of sped up or even like just concentrated on one leader. So whereas the deaths of the various peasants in the various countries, that was just progress. Because it led to capitalism, whereas when it happened under communist systems, it was, an unfettered evil because it led to communism. But yeah, capitalism relies on destitution and yeah, capitalism is a form of coercive control. It's just we all know the ideology to explain it because we live it every day. So we have to know the justifications and like feel the justifications emotionally in a way that we don't have to. When we see slavery or feudalism, we can completely disconnect and go, oh yeah, of course, no one would do that. But you can only live a system for so long before you can't help but assume that it's natural. The other video, which is the worst in terms of being upsetting, ages ago there was a documentary released, and it was called something like Very Young Girls or Real Young Girls, and it was about a prostitution exiting program for teenagers that was being run, I think, in New York, and I think it was called GEMS, and it was basically about the work that this one social worker does with these kids. And at some point in the documentary, they say something to the effect of, like, one prostituted kid can net like $100,000 in their working life. And I was thinking about this recently in relation to gender identity and the fact that if you can get a kid onto puberty blockers, you've basically got them onto cross-sex hormones and you've basically got them onto being medicalized for life. And yeah, essentially that these companies would be looking at kids in exactly the same way that a pimp is. It's just a different pimping. And there's a lot of parallels in that a lot of the kids who, like 13-year-old, like, yeah, they were saying 13, I think, is the average age of entry into prostitution. And they're all mind fucked from the abuse. And so they will still have, like, romantic feelings about the industry and the people that had abused them. And the social workers have basically got to, fight to help break that down. And yeah, I feel like gender identity puts parents in a very kind of similar situation of having to fight off pimps and groomers. So that was I told you that was the saddest one. But those are all the different ideas. Let me know which ones you think are the best. And it'll probably have no effect on anything. Yeah, thanks. I'll see you guys soon.